Something's not going to travel very far. Because it was so funny. It really was.
It was so funny.
Not at the time, no.
Oh, she didn't appreciate it. But she laughed at me.
What comes around may go around, right, Larry? All right, well, good evening. We'll go ahead and get started tonight. Let's take our Bibles and turn to Leviticus chapter 19 as we continue on. I can't say Levi turned my mic up a bit too far. I think I'm the one who set the mic levels tonight. But we'll back that off just a little bit so I don't make everybody's heads ring. Leviticus chapter 19, we're continuing on in this fourth section of Leviticus, what I've termed guidelines for practical holiness. We get into this last section, verses 17 and following, and there's this wide range of topics. There's a lot of areas where you look at a section and it's not always obvious what ties all of the various statutes that are next to each other together. But God covers a great amount of ground. And this is really, in a lot of ways, the heart of the law. When we think of the law, we think of Leviticus and God giving the ordinances and the commands to Israel. It's really this section that's kind of the prototypical section for that. All of these statute after statute, rule after rule, law after law, where God reveals to his people his character. Leviticus, particularly in this last section, is this collection of laws that, to see them rightly, I think we need to understand all of the law as an expansion of the Ten Commandments. Really, that's what we're seeing here. And so you kind of do this thing where, starting with what Christ says, the Pharisees, the scribes come to him and they say, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, well, it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. That's actually in our passage tonight. That's the core. And he says, on these, all the law and the prophets hang. Well, the next step out from that, the next expansion out from that is the Ten Commandments given in Exodus chapter 24. And they really put flesh on the bones of what does it mean if we are going to be a people who has a right relationship with God, what does that look like? How does that impact our day-to-day life? And then the next step out from the Ten Commandments is all of the law and the prophets, and particularly the rest of Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where God gives all of these detailed statutes and really digs in. And we look at this and we need to understand many of these laws are specific to Israel. They're civil laws. They're ceremonial laws for how they conducted worship. They're things that are very unique to Israel in their time and in their circumstance. But the character of God doesn't change. And so the things that we learn about God's character from the law for Israel are still just as true today as they were when he spoke to Israel then. And so even though in a lot of cases we look at these laws and we might say, well, that's not really directly applicable to us. We're not under that commandment because it's not part of God's moral character. It's a civil statute for how Israel was to deal with, recompense for theft or something like that. That's not part of our civil law. But it reveals his character. It helps us understand him better. It helps us understand how he sees us better. And so we need to recognize that, and there's a lot we can learn out of that. And so we're going to dig in this evening. I even stopped for a second. Anyway. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 1 and 2 kind of set us up for this whole section that follows. And it says here, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." This is the premise. This is the presupposition. He's going to say this a number of times throughout this chapter and in the chapters to follow. I'm the Lord your God. I'm holy. And the implication is always back to these opening two verses. I'm the Lord your God. Therefore, you're to be holy just like I'm holy. We're to be reflections of his character. It's interesting. There's this illustration. We look back at the language at the beginning of Genesis, and God creates man, and what does he say about man? He says he makes him in his image. Yeah. And we look at that word, and there's so much we could dig out of that. There's so much we talk about. God does not have a physical being, and so he's obviously not talking about he looks like us. That's not what we're discussing here, but we are in some way a reflection of, we're an image of, we're cast out of the same mold as him. And so when God creates Adam and Eve, he's got all of this creation that he's made that gives glory to him, but he chooses in the midst of it to set these image bearers to lead in worship. It's funny, the pagan scholars, secular scholars look at that and they say, the Jews, they're copying what all of the other nations do, because when a king would conquer a new land, one of the things he'd do is he'd set up statues of himself to signify that this is now my country, I've conquered it, it's mine. Well, that's exactly opposite of how that happened. God creates, and he makes Adam and Eve, and he says, this is my creation. I'm going to put my image bearers in the midst of it to reflect my glory back to myself. And human kings looked at that and said, that's a good idea. We're going to do that. And they went about and copied that and put their image, their statues up wherever they conquered. And so there's a reflection here. That's what God's talking about. He says, you're my people. If you're going to be my people, one of the things you need to do is fulfill that role that I originally created humanity for as image bearers. I'm holy, therefore you as my image bearers should be holy too. You should reflect my character. All right, Leviticus 19, continue on, verses 3 and 4. This is a very eclectic section. There's a bunch of different things that he gets into as he goes through this. But verses 3 and 4, we get kind of a recap of some of the 10 commandments. He says, every one of you shall revere his mother and his father and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols nor make for yourselves molded gods. I am the Lord your God. Most of the chapters for the rest of this book have these loosely connected common themes tying them together. They're collections of laws, reminders, they're clarifications. They serve to illustrate or give details on specific circumstances for how the nation was to live out God's holiness in practical terms. I've often said, if you want to understand the key theme of Paul, You need to recognize that Paul believed very strongly that what you believe will impact how you behave. That's why in every single one of his letters to one of the churches, he writes to a church that has serious problems in the church, but he never addresses the problems first. What's he do? Lays out a whole bunch of sound doctrine. Because his theory, his belief, his philosophy was that we need to understand God rightly, and then once we believe rightly, our behavior can follow and flow out of that. If you wanted to put a theme on what the author of Hebrews here has to say, he's saying that you have to see God rightly in order to live rightly. We need to see his character rightly. We need to understand that we're to be holy as he is holy, so we need to see what that looks like. And so all throughout this, he has this common theme where he gives commands and he comes back to, I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God. I'm the one that you're to reflect. And so he starts off, verse 3, every one of you shall revere his mother and his father and keep my Sabbaths. The two of these are tied together. They're meant to stand in for the entire Ten Commandments. They're a reminder that the presence and revelation of God was in the midst of them. They're to be living out their faith in the one true God. Family is here seen as the core unit of society. It is the only unit of society that God created before the fall of sin. And in its natural course of that unit, according to God's plan, it is the role of parents to give visible and daily illustrations of authority, of love, of consequences, and of relationship to their children, so that the children can learn those lessons from someone in authority over them who they can see, so that someday when they stand before God for themselves, they can exercise those lessons with someone they can't see. And so God takes this very seriously. You're to honor your father and mother. You're to respect that role that he's given them in your lives. He views this as a very serious thing. Later on in a couple of places, we're going to see he takes this so seriously that a child who publicly denounces and curses his parents was guilty of a capital crime and was to be taken out and stoned. That was a rejection, not just of their parents' authority, but of God's authority over them that had put their parents in their life. And so all of these ultimately are sins, not necessarily against each other, although that's who is often in view in the immediate sense. But when we rebel against these things, when we rebel against human decency, when we turn on our parents, when we steal from our neighbor, that's ultimately also a sin, and more importantly, a sin against God. It's a sin against his plan for the family. It's a sin against the authorities that he's put in his life. This is the same theory that gives us Romans chapter 13, where Paul says, all authorities that are over you are given by God. We can look at the authorities over us, and we can look at our nation sometimes and say, that is a terrible choice. That's not a God-honoring choice. And yet, God says that's an authority that I've placed in your life over you. You know, I've been enjoying pastors studying Sunday school through Daniel. Daniel is a spectacular example of that. Here's Daniel living in a nation that is filled with sin and debauchery under multiple kings, up to and including the point where, for doing nothing wrong, Daniel at one point gets tossed in the lion's den. And what's Daniel's response? He always honors the king. He always stands fast for his faith. He's willing to bear whatever consequences it requires. But you never see him backbiting or stabbing and attacking the king. He always honors the authority that God has placed in his life over him. Because he thought they were always doing the right thing? No. But because it's God who ultimately put them there. And so God takes that very seriously. It's a pattern that he sets up throughout the pages of Scripture. And so he gives us, honor your father and mother, and then you shall keep my Sabbaths. Again, a reminder that Israel has this relationship with God, and they are to honor that relationship. They're to honor God's work in their life by keeping the Sabbath that he's commanded. It's a day in and day out statement of their faith in God's provision for them. Everybody else around them is working 7 days a week. If you're a farmer, you know the work doesn't just stop because of whatever the day on the calendar says. There's always more going on. There's always something else that the farm needs. There's always something else that could be done in the crops. And yet Israel, one day out of every week, was going to sit aside and not do any of that work, not do anything to bring the harvest in, not do any of the things that the world would look at you and say, well, that's the most natural thing in the world to do. and yet God is going to bless them. And that takes an incredible amount of faith on their part. So it's a statement of their faith, and it's also a great statement of obedience that they're willing to do that. And it was meant to bring about opportunities for them to talk with the rest of the world around them and share the truth of who the one true God was. Everybody else was going to look on. When Israel was faithful to God, they would be blessed as no other nation was ever blessed in all of history. And all these other nations would do what happened when Solomon was king and Israel was for a season honoring God and at peace. They send emissaries and dignitaries and kings and wise men to come and see what's going on in Israel that's different. And they get there and they find out it's not that Israel's working harder. In fact, they're taking a day off every week. And it opened up the door to say, well, yeah, we do that because the one true God told us to do that. And he provides for us and he takes care of us. And so it gives this opportunity for them to lift up and show the one true God. Verse 4, he says, don't turn to idols nor make yourselves molded gods. I am the Lord your God. They were called on to abhor idols, to cast out everything that would take God's place in their life. Because of who he is, no graven image, no idol meant for practices of false worship can ever be anything but an attack on God. You know, unlike most religions, most pagan religions are very syncretistic. Syncretistic just means that they like to bring in all the bits and pieces, whatever works, and you bring it in and you kind of amalgamate it all together. And so we look at pagan religions throughout history, and they have a tendency to do this. You conquer a new land, and you just kind of adopt their gods too. And we see this all over. Israel would do this at times. They would start to intermarry with one of the nations around them, and they'd start to bring in the false gods. And so most pagan religions do this. The worship of the one true God cannot be syncretistic. Because the moment we take some false god, some idol, and elevate it to the level of God, we've dethroned him. We can't truly worship the one true God and also allow pagan idols in our lives. The moment we do, we've stopped true worship of the one true God. We've stopped making him unique in our hearts and minds and lives as he is and requires that we see him. And so he is very strong that Israel not have any pagan gods, no idols, no idolatry, no gilded images. You know, the one piece of furniture in all of Israel's worship that you could look at and you could kind of say, well, that's a thing that they might be tempted to worship, is the Ark of the Covenant. And it's the one piece of furniture that nobody ever sees. That's not by accident. And the few times when they do see it, you know what they do? They sin and they worship, right? They get to this place where they're in the land and the Philistines attack and they're not in right relationship with God, and in their minds, the ark has become the thing that contains God. If we take the ark with us, we're taking God with us. Whew. That's a mistaken view if ever there was one. And so they haul the ark out and take it to battle with them because, hey, we're going to take God with us. And God always wins. And what happens? They lose and the ark gets stolen. Because that's not what it is and it's not what it's for. God did not want them to have any idols. He didn't want them to have any relics. He didn't want them to have anything that they would hold up and they would say, see, this thing has power. Because they needed to recognize that all the power was God's and God's alone. Bonnie? Yeah. I was actually talking to Hannah about that earlier today, because she asked what I was talking about, and we got to chit-chatting, and she asked, so when did Moses pass away? I said, well, Moses, we sort of know. Sort of. You get to the edge of the river, and Moses hands off authority to Joshua, and then he goes up in the mountains. And that's it. You don't see him again. And it's very much that. God knows his people. And here's the guy who, by his hand, more miracles occur than anyone else in all of history save Christ alone. Easily. massive amounts of miracles, God's power on display. Moses, who speaks for God as no one else in all of history has ever spoken. No prophet after him speaks as much or is on as wide a range as Moses does. Moses, who spends so much time with God. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it says Moses spoke face to face with God as a man speaks with his friend. And he comes back down and his face shines. If they knew where Moses' body was, there'd be a shrine there. And they'd go and visit it, and they'd fall into idolatry. And so, yeah, absolutely, God has Moses disappear up onto the mountain in that way on purpose to keep Israel from falling into that sin. And so all of this is kind of, he's trying to help Israel understand in day-to-day practical terms, what does it mean? Continue on, verses 5 through 8. He reminds us of the peace offering sacrifice. He says, if you offer a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord, you shall offer it of your own free will. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it, and on the next day. And if any remains until the third day, it shall be burned in the fire. And if it is eaten at all on the third day, it is an abomination. It shall not be accepted. Therefore, everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned the hallowed offering of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. And you say, well, you know what? This is Leviticus. Just a couple of chapters back, he gave all of those instructions in much greater detail for the first time, and they got all of this already. Why are we reminding them of it again? And I would argue that it fits in here because this is the peace offering, is the offering above all the others that is an act of worship. The sin offering and the trespass offering, the burnt offering are all tied in with them dealing with sin in their lives. They're bringing it, there's worship involved, but they're bringing it because they're dealing with sin in their lives. They're dealing with atonement for that sin and making the way open for them to have right relationship with God again. The grain offering or the meat offering often accompanies other offerings. It was mandated to be given at the times of the harvests. But the peace offering, overwhelmingly, is an offering that you bring for no particular reason. It's an offering that you bring just because you want to worship. And so it's this reality that Israel, as they're reflecting God's character, as they're being his emissaries, his image bearers among the nations around them, part of that is their worship. It's their praise. It's the fact that they do honor and serve the one true God, and it's not like the pagan worship of all the nations around them. And so he wants to bring that back to their mind and keep it in the forefront of their thinking. Yeah. Right? It's such a small thing. So the peace offering is also the only one of these offerings that the offerer gets to partake in. Several of the others, the priests get to eat part of. The peace offering is the only one they get to eat part of. But they have to do it in God's way. You can eat it on the day that you sacrifice it or the next day, but nothing else. And if you eat it wrongly, then the whole thing's moot. If you don't worship the way God commands, then it's not accepted. It doesn't do any good. It's not true worship. And ultimately, you end up bearing your iniquity and cut off from the people. It's like that reality of what a holy God they worship and serve, and how carefully they need to come to him is just drummed into every bit of this.
It's like when the chief priests would cast out somebody from the tabernacle because they said, "Oh, you've sinned so much, you can't come
Right.
here anymore." And that blind man's parents, they didn't want to be cast out.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, Larry, that it's almost worse than being stoned, being cast out. In large measure, that's kind of where the Samaritan people end up. They're sort of Jewish, but not really. They're not allowed to participate, but they have some ethnic heritage with it. That's the position you were put in if you were cast out. You were Jewish. This is your whole family, your whole identity. You can participate in none of it. Not the worship. You wouldn't be accepted at most family events. You wouldn't inherit, you wouldn't be counted as a part of the people anymore for all legal and religious purposes. It was a very, very difficult thing for the Jewish people. Continue on, verse 9. I don't know that we're going to get all the way through chapter 19 tonight. We'll see. There's a bunch of stuff buried in here. Verses 9 and 10, he says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. I love how he keeps coming back to that. Because of who I am, it's going to have an impact on how you behave. This gives us a glimpse into a system that would ultimately serve the nation of Israel as a safety net for the poor and the widows and the fatherless and the stranger in the land. Rather than just allowing the poor and the destitute to starve and suffer as most nations did at this point in history, God gives Israel this built-in day-to-day method for providing for those who had no other means of provision. Some look at this and say it's an early welfare system, and I think that kind of misses the point. First off, it's not supported by work that the farmer did and had to participate in. So notice the farmer, he doesn't collect the grain and then give a mandated portion of it away to the poor. None of his labor is involved in it. He doesn't put any extra work into this at all. He just leaves some behind. He doesn't clean the corners out in his field. And so when you're going around the field and you're cutting with a scythe, naturally it's kind of leaves an arc in the corner, and you don't cut the corners. You don't go back for them. You just leave them. Wherever the arc leaves off, that's what you leave, and you leave behind. And you don't glean. So the normal practice, again, you're hand cutting the field. And so you go through and you cut down all the grain in the field, and then later you'd come back through and you'd kind of rake it all up, and the stalks that had just gotten bent over would spring up, and you'd have stalks of grain all over the place in the field. And normally the practice was somebody would go through and cut all of those and collect them because it was a reasonable amount of food that was left behind. And so God says you're not going to do either one of those things. You don't cut the corners and you don't glean the field. Same thing with your vineyards. When you go through your vineyards, you take what you get on the first pass. You don't come back through and see what else you can find, what got left over, you don't shake the bushes and see what's left in there. You leave all of that behind. And so there's no extra work required on the part of the farmer. Yeah, actually, we see this play out in Ruth's actual life. We get a lot of details about how this worked practically by reading about Ruth. Absolutely. Correct. Notice also that it's not financial. The farmer doesn't do his harvest and then sell some, and they don't just give money to the poor. It's not financial. One of the great dangers of providing for the poor by means of money is that money is fungible. That just means you can spend the same money on a bottle of alcohol as you can spend on a box of food. You can spend that money on anything. And so when you give money to someone for their needs, you lose all control over what happens to that. You often end up not meeting their needs, but the money gets spent in other ways that you weren't planning on. And so that's one of the great difficulties in any welfare system is how do you make sure that the welfare that you're giving out actually does the thing you intend on it doing? And a great amount of it goes to fraud and other ends in many cases. Tim?
And it also required the poor person to do work.
Yeah.
God said when Adam sinned, you shall survive by the sweating of our brow. That forced the poor person to go out there and do the work to get whatever.
Yeah.
It
If you were making the choice to not get a normal job because you were looking for a free ride, this wasn't it. In fact, this was probably harder work than just having your own field because you had to put a lot more effort in to get the same amount of grain. You were gleaning the leftover bits. It wasn't all nicely tight and packed and like it would have been if you'd planted it for yourself. And so, yeah, there's a couple of pieces in here that make me say this isn't a welfare system, but it is God's grace and his mercy on display so that even those who had nothing of their own, who didn't have their own farm, who didn't have a place to grow their own food, had an opportunity to see their needs met by God's grace and his provision. And so this work requirement and all the other things in it go a long way to minimizing the number of people who want to be part of this system and want to abuse part of this system. There would have been something stigmatizing about it. You couldn't do it in quiet and in you couldn't live off of the charity of others and kind of hide it from everybody. You were going to be out there visible in the field every day. That's one of the interesting things we learn about Boaz's character when we read the story of Ruth. Boaz was under no requirement to do anything for the gleaners other than leave the gleanings there. But you remember what he does? He leaves extra, but also he invites the gleaners to come and partake in the midday meal with his workers. He has no requirement to do that. But he's a godly man who wants to honor the Lord, wants to show grace and charity. That's his personal choice. That's not mandated by the law. But he's looking at what God's doing, and he's taking his cue from that and showing grace and mercy to those who are less fortunate than him. And so there's a great lesson built in there. God is teaching Israel how to be a compassionate people, while also wisely and drastically reducing the number of people who would want to abuse a system like this. And so he gives this glimpse of it here. There's more detail that'll come on this later. But he starts out this pattern of setting Israel up to provide for the needs of their people without needing to go through all the hoops that a lot of other nations would go through to do the same thing. Pick up verses 11 through 18. We see another section of things that Israel was to avoid. Many of these overlap heavily with the Ten Commandments. He says, you shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. You shall not cheat your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall not do injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. He has this whole litany of reminders to Israel that a relationship with the one true God would lead to right relationships with the men and the women around you. And so he goes through this. Verse 11, you shall not steal. You don't have any right to somebody else's property. To do so is an attack on God's character. It's saying God's not taking good enough care of me. I deserve something that God has not provided for me. Nor shall you deal falsely. Not only outright theft, but also dealing falsely is the idea of that you would have false business practices, that you'd be doing shady things, that you'd be doing unscrupulous business deals. It says you don't need to do any of that. Be honest and upright. Have integrity in the work that you do. Nor lie to one another. You don't need to cheat and swindle. You don't need to try and pull one over on somebody else. You need to be a people of truth and integrity, just like I am a God of truth and integrity. And so you need to reflect my character. Verse 12, he says, you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. Israel would have this idea, it's very common, this idea that the more serious about something we are, the higher in authority we sort of appeal to. Christ, of course, comes along and tells us that our yea ought to be yea and our nay ought to be nay. We should just always be honest all the time, and then we don't have to go around saying, oh, well, I swear on my mother's grave, or, people, all kinds of foolish things. But, of course, in Israel, the highest thing you could reach for would be, well, I swear by the Lord God. And God says, don't you dare ever do that and make it false. You be careful. If you're going to invoke my name, make sure you're telling the truth and that you are reflecting my character. You need to honor me in all you do. Nor shall you profane the name of your God. You shouldn't be doing anything or saying anything that's going to be a slight or a shade upon my name. In your dealings with the other nations around you, you need to interact with them in a way that makes them want to know who your God is, not that makes them worry that your God is just like their gods. Another, pagan idol. Verse 13, he says, you shall not cheat your neighbor nor rob him. We shouldn't be seeking to take advantage of those around us. The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you all night until morning. The idea that you hired somebody, you promised them payment, and then you delay and you stall and I'll give it to you later. If you made a commitment, pay it up on time. Make sure that you're meeting all of your commitments. You need to be a people of integrity. And then verse 14, he says, you shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. That's just two such terrible examples. But the point he's getting at here is we shouldn't be trying to take advantage of those that we think aren't going to catch us. Just because we think we can get away with something doesn't mean we should be doing it. The world's view on this is, well, hey, if you're not cheating, you're not trying, right? Whatever you can get away with, that's how much you can do. And it doesn't really matter what the law says or what the right thing is. If I'm not going to get caught, who cares? God says that's not at all right. The deaf will never hear you curse him, but honor me and don't do that. Do the right thing, even if he'll never hear it. The blind guy will never see that you slide the stick over in front of him, but don't do that. It's do the right thing, even when nobody's going to notice, even when nobody's there to see, even if nobody's ever going to catch you doing the wrong thing. Honor me, fear me, and recognize that you have a responsibility to do the right thing and to live rightly before me because of who I am. Notice how he keeps tying all of these back to, I am the Lord, I am your God. Fear the Lord your God. You're doing the right thing, not because there's some brownie points to be earned or because we're getting points in heaven or because somebody could catch you or whatever. You're doing the right thing because we serve the God who is a righteous and a holy God. We're to be his image bearers. We're to be reflections of his character. And so his love and his grace and his character and truth and justice and all of his attributes should be reflected back in us in our day-to-day lives. Verse 15, you shall not do injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the mighty. That's this right here. This does not get enough credit in our modern world. But when our founders, not all men who we would look at and say had a saving faith, but very many of them, the vast majority of them, men who were very familiar with the Bible, when they went looking for principles they wanted to build a nation on, one of them that was somewhat unique to them was the idea of blind justice. No other nation had ever had blind justice before. But that wasn't an idea that they came up for the first time on their own. They found that in the pages of Scripture. And so he comes back, and we would often say, well, it's a bad thing if you go to court and the guy with more money always wins. Like, that's very intuitive to us. That's an idea that comes up a lot. But notice what he says first. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. When somebody's standing in judgment, whether they're rich, whether they're poor, whether they're disadvantaged, whether you feel sorry for them or not, none of that should have anything to do with anything. The judgment should be made based on what really happened. What's the truth of the matter? That's why when we talk about blind justice, I love the symbolism of Lady Justice. She wears a blindfold. She has no idea who's before her. She can't see. The idea is that she doesn't even know who's before her, and it doesn't matter. Because the law is the law, and it should be treated fairly to all men and all women in all times. And that's the principle that God lays out here for them. When you're carrying out judgment in your nation, it shouldn't matter whether it's a rich man or a poor man. It shouldn't matter whether they know the king or whether they're a stranger in the land. They should receive fair and equal treatment. Because I am a just God, and so you should reflect that before me. So he says, you shall not honor the person of the mighty, In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. Verse 16, you shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shouldn't be a gossip in your community. You shouldn't go around being a talebearer. We live in this modern age. There's so many things about the modern era that are good things. As with every tool in all of history, it can be put to good uses and also evil uses. We rejoice in, we have the technology of the internet, and we can live stream, and we can very easily and at very little cost allow the words of Scripture to go out and be easily heard, easily digested anywhere around the world somebody wants to. Also, have you been on the internet lately? It's just an absolute garbage heap. I would not advise. Hey, be very cautious when you spend time online. Because like every tool in all of history, there's just so much out there. One of the things that this makes me think of, there's been this trend that's popped up in the last couple of decades, community apps. And so a lot of communities have a community app where they encourage everybody in the city or village or whatever to be a part of this chat thread, basically. And they can share, like so-and-so lost their dog or something's happening. And some of the uses for it are very good. Something's going on in the city, something that, like, it's an easy way to spread information. In a lot of ways, it fills the role that the newspapers would have back when people were still getting newspapers very regularly. But also, it's just a cesspool of everybody bickering and fighting with each other because you can say anything you want on it. And so the God is looking at that, and he says, look, you shouldn't be the talebearers among your people. Don't be going around backbiting and bickering and arguing and airing the dirty laundry and trying to get somebody else in trouble with everybody else in the cul-de-sac and all of that. That's not a reflection of my character, so it shouldn't be a part of your lives. Vonnie, yeah. Sometimes that happens. It shouldn't, but sometimes it happens, yeah. And that's one of those things where we have to guard against that. It's a very natural human tendency. We like to feel like we're in the know on something. And so it's very easy to get caught up in that gossip. But God doesn't want that. That's not a reflection of his character. And he says, also at the end of verse 16, he says, you shall not take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. We shouldn't be quick to turn on each other, quick to hold. He'll go on and say, hold a grudge and hate our brother in the next verse. He desires that we have a common love and desire to help and be a blessing and encouragement to one another. Sometimes that's not easy for us. Sometimes we have people we just don't get along. That's okay, by the way. Not everybody has to be best friends with everybody. It's okay to have somebody that just, we just don't click. But we need to be careful that doesn't turn into a reason to be disingenuous with each other or to be attacking and hurting one another or to hold a grudge against one another. Just because we're not the best of friends doesn't instantly make it okay for us to turn on it and attack one another. Verse 17, he continues on, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. Remember, this is one of those issues that comes up. Christ deals with this in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you've heard it said, you shall not murder, but I say unto you, if you hate your brother in your heart, you've committed murder already. And the Jews listen to that and they say, what is he talking about? It's right there. It's the message from the beginning. It was the way they were supposed to understand the law from the get-go. But in our humanity, we look at stuff like this, and we tend to try to make it a series of checklists. We tend to do the Pharisaical thing, and I've done this, and I've done this, and I didn't do that, and I didn't do that, and I'm all set with God. I'm good. And we struggle to recognize that he's giving us examples here of what it looks like to love him and to love our neighbors around us. He's not just giving us a checklist. And so he says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. And then look at the flip side of that. You shouldn't hate your brother in your heart, but you shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. On the one hand, he says, don't hate your brother. We shouldn't bear hatred towards anyone. But also, when your neighbor is going off into sin, you shall surely rebuke him. Sometimes we fall to prey to the temptation of saying, well, you know what, that's not my thing. I don't want to be involved in that. And I want to put my head down and keep my distance and not get in the middle of that mess. He says, no, you have a responsibility. If that's your neighbor, that's your brother, that's your friend, and you see sin in their life, you should say something. You should go to them. Matthew 18, particularly within the body of Christ, we have a responsibility to go to them, not to everybody else, but to go to them and encourage them to return to a right walk with the Lord. Don't bear iniquity in your own life because you're unwilling to challenge your neighbor to walk rightly with the Lord. Verse 18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. We shouldn't be holding bitterness in our heart and holding that grudge often for years and years and years. I'm always fascinated. We as humans have this incredible ability to look at everything that we do in the best possible light and everything that everybody else does in the worst humanly possible light. And somehow in our humanity, we don't see the contradiction in that in our own minds. It just never dawns on us. I will never forget, I had this interaction, a guy I worked with years and years ago, no longer works with us, was having some real struggles, had some real bitterness in his life. And I got to talking to him one day about one of the instances that had just happened. And it turns out he was upset about something that just happened, but what he was really upset about was something that, frankly, I thought was quite trivial, that had happened almost 20 years before. And he'd been just harboring that grudge and angry about it the entire time. And so when something else little came along, he just blew up over it. Well, it surprised everybody else because nobody else even remembered the thing from 20 years ago. But it was on the top of his mind. He'd been seething over it the entire time. We have a real human tendency to want to do that. And so God warns about that. He says, don't take vengeance, don't bear a grudge. Those things should be left to the Lord. That's not ours to clean up. As much as he is gracious and kind and forgiving to us, we ought also to be so to those around us. And he ends that verse 18. He says, but you shall not, instead of bearing vengeance and bearing a grudge, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Whew. Love your neighbor as yourself. That is an incredibly high bar. That's a task that we can spend the rest of our lives striving for and will never fully succeed. We have this innate desire to take care of ourselves first. We have this, it doesn't always come up, but every once in a while you get something that needs to be split in half in our house. At our house, the rule is whoever's splitting it in half, one person cuts it, the other person picks. And let me tell you, nobody is ever so exact. Like the tape measure comes out and we get half. But if you let one person cut and one person pick, invariably, one of those pieces is bigger than the other. And they know for sure which one it is, let me tell you. It's very human. We want to take care of ourselves first. And God says our responsibility in light of his character that we're supposed to be living out and reflecting is that we ought to love our brother as ourselves. We ought to love our neighbors ourselves. We ought to be looking out for those around us and showing them the same kind of love that God has for us. All right, continue on verse 19. We're not going to finish the chapter tonight. Spoiler alert. Nobody's shocked by that. Leviticus 19:19, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind. You shall not sow your field with mixed seed, nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you. This is an interesting verse. this is probably the verse that people who look at Scripture and don't believe it, but instead want to find in it some way to attack Christians, this is the one all of them know is there. Almost none of them can tell you where it is, but they know it's there, and they can quote it to some degree or another. This has actually come up on a couple of times on TV shows. It gets quoted, and it's kind of, you're taking down those fundamentalist Christians who don't even believe their own Bible, and they come after you because you're wearing a mixed linen and wool garment, and you don't even care about the Bible. It's an interesting verse. It's interesting first because it's here. And so that's why I say there's a bunch of these that as God is working through his list of various things that he's encouraging Israel in, various reminders that he's giving them, there's some of these passages, some of these verses, some of these statutes that you come to, and I'm not going to tell you that I have a great answer for why all of them are right next to the other verse that it's next to. I'm stumped on a few of them. But I think I have an answer for this one. We've just gotten done with all of these various things, attacks on our neighbor, attacks on the deaf, attacks on the blind, injustices, rebuking our neighbor, bearing a grudge, and all of it comes back to this idea that we are to reflect the character of the Lord. And then he transitions to, you're going to keep my laws, and there's three things that you're not going to do, that you're not going to mix together. You're not going to let your livestock breed with another kind. You're not going to sow your field with mixed seeds. And you're not going to wear a garment of mixed linen and wool together. And in our humanity, I'll tell you, the first time I read that, I went, why is that there? Why is that there? So let's deal with what I think all three of these things are, and then I'll answer the why. So the first one, breeding animals of kinds. There's a little bit of uncertainty on this. So the word that's used for kind here is the same word that's used back in Genesis when God talks about making animals and each one of them reproduces after their own kind. So that's a little fuzzy when you get into the biology of it, deciding exactly what kind equates to in our modern biological categorization of animals. As a rule of thumb, kinds can't actually reproduce with things outside of their own kind as we understand it. That's generally not physiologically possible. So either, that's a fairly generic word, and he just generally means here that you shouldn't be, we've got this kind of sheep and this kind of sheep, and you shouldn't be crossbreeding them. Or he's possibly talking about not letting his animals abuse each other. I don't want to be crass here, but when you have a breeding animal, particularly sometimes the male breeding animal gets overly excited and will do his thing with animals, doesn't really matter if it's a female of the same species or not. And so he may have been discouraging that behavior as well. Either way, he's setting up a standard for them here. Don't let your livestock breed with another kind. The second one, he says, you shall not sow your field with mixed seed. The idea there is that you're going to take two different crops and plant them in the same ground. We would look at that today. Actually, that's seen a resurgence today. That's something that's become very popular again. Farmers looking for two crops that they can get pretty much full yields out of on the same plot of ground. Now you're getting double use out of the ground. And in a lot of cases, what they find or what they're looking for is a case where the two crops complement each other and they help mitigate the fatigue on the soil from just the one crop over and over and over again. So we would look at that and we would honestly say that in a lot of cases, that might not be a bad thing. We're not, why would God not want them to grow two different crops in the same field? And then the third one, you shall not wear a garment of mixed linen and wool, shall not come upon you. This one has a little bit of interest to it. If you read the rabbis, their answer to this one is that it's a matter of keeping things separate. And so they would look at it and say that, well, the priests wore a linen cloak, a linen undergarment, a linen tunic, and then the priestly breastplate and garb and the robe that the priests wore were made out of wool. And so that was something, marrying the mixed garments was something only the priests were supposed to do. I don't think that's it. Because the priest had a garment made of linen and then another garment made of wool. That's not what this says. This says a garment of mixed linen and wool together. And so I don't think that's what we're talking about here, despite the fact that that's the predominant Jewish interpretation. I'll get myself in a little trouble here. A lot of times if you go back and you read the notes in the Torah or you read the predominant Hebrew interpretations, you get a lot of interesting history, you get a lot of tradition. There's a lot that can be learned from that. I would argue in the vast majority of cases, they tend to be sort of slipshod with the actual text. They tend to care a lot more about what the tradition says and what Rabbi so-and-so said than what the actual text says. That's a real problem for me. And so I don't always, just because that's what the rabbis taught, doesn't usually sway my opinion very much. This would be a case in point. So we look at all of these, and you kind of say, all right, well, now we sort of understand what they all are, Ben, but what's the big deal? I think there's two things here that really come to the forefront. There has been an argument made that a couple of these may have been part of pagan practices, may have been common pagan rituals. I haven't seen a lot of evidence for that, but it's certainly true. But I think what's absolutely true is that these were things that would have gone on commonly, whether they were tied to pagan rituals or not. All of these would have been things that would have been common in the world around them. And so just like so many of the other rituals that God gave Israel, I think the real point is to make Israel unique. The real point is to make them stand out and be different. And then when you are out in the world and they say, hey, would you like this garment? Oh, sorry, I'm not interested in that garment. Well, why not? It's got mixed linen and wool. God says we're not supposed to do that. That starts a conversation. It gives an opportunity. The farmer comes along and says, hey, we figured out if you breed this kind of bull and that kind of cow together, you get this, whatever. And the Hebrews say, no, we're not interested in that. Were you sure? It gives better milk. It tastes, whatever. No, we're not interested. God said we shouldn't do that. And oh, by the way, the farmer you're talking to who's telling you that he's got a better way to do it, that the Jews are turning away, they're also standing there noticing that the Jews have sleeker, fatter, healthier-looking cows than everybody else has. And that they don't have any of the problems with disease among their cows that everybody else has. Because when Israel was obedient to God, he had promised to bless in such a way that they would have an overabundance. None of their cattle would ever have difficulty in birthing. They'd always have healthy animals. They would never have the diseases and the plagues that had come on all the other nations around them. And so Israel was supposed to stand out not only because of God's blessing, but also he gives them a number of these rituals that you really can't find anything else in them other than to make them unique, to make them distinct. I like the word the King James uses, probably just because I grew up with it, but to make them peculiar, strange, stand out. It was supposed to give an opportunity for them to share the truth of the one true God. We do these things because God told us to. And so it opens up doors for them to have those conversations, for them to make those connections and to deal with the people around them. Oh, yeah, there's lots of them. It's what they eat. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Amen. Right. It is. It's not that there's anything, depending on exactly what you think a few of those things are, you might say there's something wrong with a couple of them, but I don't think that's the point. The point wasn't necessarily that those were wrong, so you had to be holy because that's a wrong thing and you shouldn't do it. The point was, God is holy, and our whole life should be overarched with that. You know what? One of the things I had a conversation years and years ago with a guy who came to me one day, and he said, so do you think it's important that we dress up when we go to church? I said, well, what do you mean by important? He says, well, like, are you going to get less out of the service? Are you going to? He said, no. You're not going to get more out of the service because you wore a shirt and tie. You're not going to get extra credit with God because you dressed up. He says, so what's the point? Well, if we love God, don't we want to give him more than just our average, everyday, scruffy clothes? You know, not that there's any, if that's what you have, absolutely. But if we love him, doesn't that impact the way we live? It changes how we behave. I'll be careful how I say this. Young fellas, when we were courting our girls, you cleaned up and you did your hair and you made sure you smelled nice before you went over to her house, right? You wanted something special. That when something's important to us, we want to make it special. And that's what a lot of this is. It's making Israel unique. It's making them stand out. It's making them different to reflect the fact that they were God's people and not just part of the world. All right, I'm going to leave off there. I sort of want to get into the next passage, but we'll have plenty of time for that. Is there evening service next week? No, because there's the two other things going on, and not the week after that because of Easter. So in 3 weeks, we'll come back to finish up Leviticus chapter 19. I'm going to kill the live stream, but if anybody has any questions...